Well, comrades, apologies that we don't have Michael Roberts present right now. Michael has previously spoken on all issues relating to the world economy, on specific issues on Britain, on the long depression as a perspective for the world economy, on the cost of living crisis, on the pandemic and so forth. A very fruitful person indeed when it comes to Marxist analysis. We'd asked him to speak specifically on the growing banking crisis, which has started in a sense at a weak point in American banking system, with the bank which is attached to the IT companies and innovation in California, but then rapidly spread to other banks in the States, or those who are particularly vulnerable, and then to Switzerland, and then to elsewhere. And everywhere there's a crisis, it seems now, in terms of regulation. Many of the regulations which were set out after the crisis in 2008 have not been followed. Because it impedes the profits in the banking system. And we've seen now a rapid transfer of crisis from one sector to the other. The question I would like to have raised with Michael, but I'll just raise these for some discussion, is that we've also seen precipitous crashes in country defaults, Argentine being one, Pakistan being another, Sri Lanka being another, and we could probably add to the list if I just read enough to see what was taking place. In other words, many countries, not just corporate bodies, which are moving into a crisis which is irresolvable because there's not sufficient economic growth to be able to pay back any of those debts. And at the same time, the capitalist system's not prepared to cancel these debts. Now, the question then I've raised is a little from the South, just to bring in some South African context to the discussion, is that, well, maybe BRICS, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and so forth, could form a financial base which would be separate from the world capitalist system, and globalization allow these countries to escape and to guarantee some financial stability into their future. If comrades would see on the WIN debate list, I put in a quote there from the Chinese bankers, which is the state bankers, and they are actually as worried as the Americans are that the crisis could spread into China itself. So no part of the world system, in my view, is immune to crashes. And we are seeing, partly we'll see the banking system as a drag on all world's growth at the moment, and the possibility of a recovery out of the long depression, which Michael Roberts has previously explained. And we could see sharp crises now, re-emerging. Just one last point. The banks in America have emerged from the crisis. This Californian bank, which linked to the IT companies, on the basis of another bank buying them out. But then, and as I showed in that the notes that I've circulated for the discussion, that is only on the basis of the federal government propping up the second bank. In other words, the one buying it out and guaranteeing that all those debts would be met. Now, this is an extremely risky way of resolving a crisis. Capitalism is trying to pursue its goals without capitalist crisis. In other words, previously, the banks would have gone to the wall and crashed. And that would have, in a sense, then in a long term, restabilized, capitalism. But on the basis of saving one company after the other, and the same way in the Chinese bureaucracy of saving one property company against another, it means that there is going to be an erosion of all confidence in the capitalist system and the exchange system around the world. I've said a little bit too much. I think let's have some discussion around the issues. Matthew, you volunteered to come in. Please do. And then please, would others indicate as you would like.
All right, thanks, comrades. No, just a brief with some points, I think, which are important. I think from what David said, I mean, first of all, of course, is the interconnection of the system. The system of finance capital is all now bound up together. So therefore, it's extremely difficult to say, okay, we can let bank X go bust because it's connected to all the others, and therefore, any actual move to do that, of course, and undermines everything else. And it's very extremely difficult, if not impossible, to unravel the connections between any given part of the system and the rest of it. So this is why banks now are propped up rather than they go bust, because the whole damn thing basically exists as a single piece. I think that there's a few points. So you think, as in general, it is to look at finance capital, as has been said in numerous places, and including Marx, of course, is that finance capital is parasitic on production, and finance capital, of course, is now, of course, a multiple size of a productive capital. It's huge. The parasite is bigger than the host, and it's actually now, get to the point where it's actually killing off chunks of the host. If you work for a large capitalist company, I mean, these places are actually stuffed full of accountants whose job basically is to suck the blood of the system for the needs of finance capital. It penetrates everywhere into production, and then, of course, causes huge problems within it. The second thing, of course, is that what you're getting, of course, is that the capitalist class is unwilling to invest in production, and of course continually demands returns, and therefore what we're seeing is the creation of large volumes of fictitious capital, which are more or less divorced from production, i.e. it doesn't function properly as capital. Capital has to confront labor, has to extract a surplus. But of course, what we're now seeing, of course, is it's pure M prime, with no the actual connection to the extraction of surplus value becomes increasingly distant, if it exists at all. So therefore, you would expect extreme instability, which is what we are seeing. The third point, I think, that's important, of course, is that this system is also becoming increasingly criminal in nature. Even looking at the laws of the countries concerned, never mind what any decent person or socialist would instate, that actually under the laws of the capitalist system, finance capital is increasingly criminal, and will carry out any kind of extortion or criminality or evasion of laws or whatever else. And we can see this, so you can look at the likes of all this stuff that's been revealed, the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers and all the rest of it. But I mean, even going down to the point of things like Bernie Madoff, and indeed, some of the stuff that's been going on, FTX, the crypto mob, because I mean, it's a Ponzi scheme. Crypto is a Ponzi scheme, which is based on fictitious capital, effectively. So all of this has been facilitated by finance capital, as I say, is a criminal thing, and this essentially, I mean, the largest banks in the world are headed by people who could be prosecuted reasonably with the evidence against them, but are not. I mean, the Department of Justice in the US actually invented this schedule, that there are people too big to jail, that you can, in the US, you can jail millions of workers. Literally, you can have 2 million people in the American gulag for doing, almost nothing. And yet the biggest criminals in the place are immune from anything because they're too big to jail. There's financial aristocracy. I think the fourth thing that we have to also understand, of course, when you're looking at these things, is that the notions of regulation now are purely notional. Regulations of banks are now notional. They're not actually carried out. It's quite clear if you look at things like the Silicon Valley Bank. I mean, it was pointed that Silicon Valley Bank actually existed on the basis of a fairly simple scheme of buying government bonds, which at the time was making them enormous amounts of money. So they were quite happy. And of course, they were never going to go to jail, so there's no problem with that. But of course, it left them open to huge risk. But nobody actually asked the question. Bernie Madoff, similarly, who of course did actually go to jail, but the people who facilitated him didn't. Instead said, well, if you'd asked the question, what am I doing? Then you'd have found that I was running a Ponzi scheme. They didn't bother asking. So I mean, essentially, regulation is purely for the birds at this point. The fifth thing, I think, which we should actually point out now, and what comes out of 2008 is all banks are nationalised, de facto nationalised. It's an odd form of nationalisation, but what it means is that banks actually, the only reason the system exists and continues is because they are guaranteed by the state. There's no other reason for these things to continue to exist. And if they hadn't been guaranteed to the state, they would have unraveled like a load of old knicker elastic and the thing would have gone down the tube. So all banks were given the state guarantee. You can see this. The thing that reveals this, of course, is the I'll offer two things that reveal this. One, of course, is Iceland, which shows you cannot have a large bank and a small state because the state can't guarantee the bank. And the other one, of course, is Scotland. The fun thing about Scotland, of course, is that as soon as you got the position after 2008, when people started talking about Scottish independence for their own political reasons, there were a whole bunch of rather large banks which were technically and legally headquartered in Edinburgh. As soon as Scottish independence became on the table, all of these banks did a runner to London double quick, because obviously, again, you can't have a large bank guaranteed by a small state. It doesn't work. So therefore, what exists, of course, is now a position in which the state, essentially has now guaranteed that it will bail out all the banks, that it will cover any losses, that it will attempt to prevent the whole system from unraveling and collapsing. But yet, if these things can declare something notionally called a profit, they can make off with it. Unfortunately, nobody seems to be pointing this out, that of course, essentially, everybody else is on the hook for these things, and a few people, the shareholders, et cetera, can make off with whatever they like, effectively, if they can declare a profit. So it is, I mean, it's nakedly a robbery, basically. The other point I think that's important, and it bears in the other thing that David has said about the global south, is the move on interest rates. Now, the way out, of course, out of 2008, that the states chose primarily was quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing essentially means that we shall create a whole lot of money, which of course is an idea come up with by particularly obviously Ben Bernanke, who was an expert on the 1930s, who was put in as chairman of the US Fed, which of course is the most important financial institution in the world, state financial institution. Now he of course was known as Helicopter Ben, because he said, well, the reason we should keep the economy inflated by saying, okay, well, we'll create a lot of money and then we'll shove it out of a helicopter and people will spend it and keep the economy going. Of course, they didn't choose to do that. Why would they want to throw money out of helicopters to the unwashed when they can give it to themselves? That's what they did. They created a lot of money and they kept creating a lot of money and they gave it to themselves. So essentially what's happened is the states create a load of money and they give it to banks for free. That's what reflated the banking system and kept it going. And that, of course, the other thing, of course, about that, of course, is a lot of that money actually went to play. Didn't stay in the places like it was created, like the US or the UK or the EU. It actually went to the global south. So you saw a lot of that money went to places like Turkey and wherever else. The problem that's actually that came about, and what's actually prompted the current situation, of course, is the rise of the working class. Well, you have inflation, and obviously the working class then says, right, okay, well, clearly, why are our wages being cut yet again, you rotten swine? So you have obviously a wave of strike action across the globe, and particularly obviously in the US, which is extremely important. I mean, obviously that's the global hegemon. So therefore, the actual class struggle in the US is more important in many ways than anywhere else in the world. So the response of the capitalist class then, of course, is and particularly obviously led by the US Fed and the current chairman, Jerome Powell, is to say, right, we'll jack up interest rates. And Powell has said this on a number of occasions. He's actually said, right, okay, well, we're doing this in order to crush the workers. He's not been shy about it. He's just said, we'll put up interest rates in order to crush the working class and put pressure on them and make sure that we throw a load of them out of work and stop them from demanding their living standards be maintained through the point of inflation. Now, of course, this is then run through the system, because obviously instead of pumping money into it, now they're now taking money out of it through interest rates. And this, of course, then triggers off what we've got now, is a situation where, I mean, Silicon Valley Bank effectively failed because it was buying, it was getting free money, it was getting its money that it was having on deposit from all its customers, some of whom, of course, were depositing, you know, tens of millions of pounds, tens of millions of dollars, of course, way above the insured limit of $250,000. And then what they were doing, of course, was buying government bonds with it, because I mean, government bonds are, you know, an assured income, you know, and of course they didn't have to pay people interest for the money they had on deposit, and therefore they were making huge amounts of money off government bonds. The only problem is, of course, when interest rates are effectively zero, you're laughing. If interest rates start going up, of course, your government bonds effectively go down. And in fact, you know, effectively the value of what you're holding in replacement of money starts going down the tube, and you've got a real problem. And this is why you had the run on Silicon Valley Bank, because everybody can see the difference between what they were holding in the back and what they were liable to from the customers was, you know, large and getting bigger, because then in order to pay out the customers, they had to go and sell government bonds at a loss. So that's effectively what blew the hole through that one. But it also, of course, then as they increase interest rates, of course, it then has the effect, of course, of sucking money out of where they've put money into the global south. It sucks money out of that as well, starts producing a crisis all over the place. Obviously, creates the crisis through all the bits that they didn't resolve in 2008. Credit Suisse, and Credit Suisse is known to be you know, extremely vulnerable, so propped up again, effectively handed over, bailed out. Even more centrally, of course, Deutsche Bank. I mean, Deutsche Bank, of course, is known, you know, to be a basket case. And of course, you know, Deutsche Bank shares went down through the tubes, through the floor. Deutsche Bank's credit default swaps, which are effectively an index on how likely people think the thing's going to go down the tube, went skywards. So, you know, all of that question, you know, and that again, I mean, extremely, you know, it's not called Deutsche Bank for nothing. And the problem is, of course, then all of these things are also on hook for a whole series of other questions. I mean, Deutsche Bank in particular, of course, is on the hook for a whole bunch of commercial property loans, including, of course, they were financing one Donald Trump. Didn't do them any good, because, of course, he always rips people off. But there's a whole series of these sectors which then are going to cause trouble into the rest of the banking system. So the whole thing is deeply unstable. And liable to unravel. And the problem is that the states are then going to say, right, okay, well, we're desperately trying to bail this thing out, and we'll use, you know, basically the money of the rest of the population to keep all this stuff from unraveling. So it's going to get interesting, I think, in the next period. So that's an impromptu introduction. Thanks.
Well, look, thank you, Matthew. Some important points there. I wondered if others would, you know, prepare to come in on the discussion. You see, you know, just to reinforce one of your points, Matthew, the sort of guaranteed, the guarantees that are extended to banks, as you mentioned, the minimum guarantee is for $250,000. But now, if they guarantee a bank buying out another bank, then they're guaranteeing billions and billions. And who knows where, you know, where that ends, and where the distrust in the currency then, you know, then arises. Just one other point I want which filters into this discussion, along with the readings that I put up on the Wind debate, there was another reading which related to the fact that in Britain, working people have not made any gains in the past 70 years, 70 years. In other words, we're in a long depression, which Michael Roberts has previously discussed. And now any gains which have been made in the recent past have been wiped out through inflation. And despite a massive strike movement, we've still not caught up to the losses, you know, in inflation. And that raises another crisis for the banking system, because it all depends on growth, depends on consumer consumption, particularly in America and Britain and Europe. And if that's not happening, then the whole basis for stability in terms of the cycles, the circuits of capital, where you go to money, commodity, and back to money again, is interrupted. Do we have any indications of others who'd like to come in? Carol, are you indicating? Oh, Jack. Yeah, please come in, Jack. Yeah, good to see you, Jack.
Yes, hi, David. I'm sorry, because of the time difference and my fatigue, I missed the presentation, but I did hear Michael's presentation at the with David McNally a few days ago. So I have a question. I don't know whether Michael covered this, and if he didn't, then I think it's germane, which is what he sees the role of China and the new Cold War between the U.S. and China, it's being called, the effect that that's having. I know he's commented frequently on the supply chain problems causing the spike in inflation. But why was inflation low in the previous decade before the pandemic, or most of that decade? Did it have anything to do with the production in East Asia, China, Korea, and Taiwan, providing cheap commodities and cheap labor, and concomitantly the end of that now, or the U.S. attempting to batter China down to prevent it surpassing the U.S. Is that having a counter effect? So in other words, was inflation kept low in part because of production out of particularly China and also elsewhere in East Asia in the decade prior to the pandemic?
Well, Jack, I think what you've missed and coming in a little late is that we haven't actually had the presentation, but your question's a penetrating one, and something I raised in some partly in the discussion. Let's keep the ball rolling. And
can I ask one more? Can I ask one more question? Then?
Yeah, please do. Yeah,
which is I think it's important to have a discussion. I was hoping to ask Michael why what the negative effects of inflation are to the bourgeoisie, why they are so determined to hold inflation down. It's clear that runaway inflation makes it difficult for them to continue their reproduction cycle. But beyond that, they're fixated on trying to batter it down very low. And I think it's important to understand why. I'm not sure if I fully understand it.
Yeah, well, also a penetrating question, which I'd like to raise with Michael too. But Jack, if you could just hold your fire and let's see how answers arise in the discussion. It's good to see you. Carol, would you like to come in? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, a couple of things about China in particular and inflation. I think the bourgeoisie has a very mixed, a lot of people in the American ruling class don't particularly like, what his name is doing at the Fed in terms of raising, because in fact, Elizabeth Warren, who's an economist and a senator from Massachusetts, is talking about the fact that with him raising inflation in the way that he is, or raising the interest rates, millions more people will be unemployed, and that's going to be a real big problem for the American government, not only stabilizing whatever the extent that they can, but it's going to piss people off. People are, starting to go out on strike, not to the extent that they are in Britain or France or anything like that, but they are beginning to go out on strike in the United States. The teachers union, in fact, in California, there was 48,000 teaching assistants, adjuncts, people like that who just concluded a strike, which, I mean, in my opinion, it was not that successful, but the UAW is organizing lots of education workers, millions of them now. But my question is does it appear to other people that the period that we're in seems very similar to World War I, in the sense that, when Germany was, the upstart essentially, and believed that it should be able to compete with the British and the French, and they said, no, you're not going to do that. And, we have World War I. I mean, I feel like this is a similar situation with China, and that because the United States is really, falling down in terms of its ability to produce things. It's not creating any new industry at all, or any factories, and millions of people are out of work. And now we had this crisis in East Palestine with an entire town that, because of the railroads wanting to make as much profit as they could, poisoning millions of people and animals. And it's clear that the United States is on the decline, and they know it. Everybody knows it. Is this going to be some sort of precursor for war with China? So that's my question.
Thanks, Carol. Dominic, would you like to come in?
John Byrne.
Okay, John, hi.
Yeah, I want to come in on the issue of, if you like, the banking crisis. Boris Johnson, when he became Prime Minister about 3 years ago, steps of Downing Street said his priority was to cure the care sector. Now, the care sector in Britain, probably like most industrial nations, is a very large area of the economy. In Britain's case, it was publicly owned mostly through the local authorities. We now have the situation where it's been privatized and is owned, as far as I know, by hedge funds. And that is in absolute crisis. Like the health service, it has about 150,000 vacancies in Britain. The service has about 150,000 vacancies. And the health service now seems to have vultures circling in all directions. There are adverts on the television to go for private care, etc. And these are all, if you like, rights that are feeding off nationalised or previously a publicly owned economy. Another sector of the economy that is now privatised, that was very much publicly owned, was the education system, with huge academy chains opening up, and all this in the name of capitalism. The issue I'm trying to raise, and not particularly well, is the fact that the banking crisis will hit home to many people, because when Labour, if it does get in, I see Keir Starmer almost the biggest obstacle, Labour getting in at the next election, then he will be faced, and the Labour government will be faced with an absolute crisis. The Tories are faced with an at the moment, but they're just turning about. The only issue they're interested in is the small boats. So that is the one big issue that they're pursuing. Listening today on the television, Suella Braverman talk about her job as Home Secretary was absolutely disgusting.
Mm-hmm.
The words now is dog whistle politics, where she basically comes out as an ultra racist, was blaming, if you like, gangs for the responsibility of the small boats, sort of never been asked by the journalists, which was referred to earlier, why Britain has not set up some form of vetting system for people trying to get to Britain. has made guarantees to Hong Kong, to the Ukraine. It also made guarantees to Afghanistan. In the 70s and 80s, and helped Somalis come here during their civil war period. Yet there are many Somalis who have, if you like, roots in Britain. There are many Afghans that served the British Army, served NATO, were given guarantees. So whatever the area of the economy you look at, if you look at housing, that's in an absolute crisis at the moment. I'm talking about Britain, but I think this could be reflected definitely in the Americas or the United States, but probably in much of Europe. And as far as I see it, the banking crisis is, if you like, that little brick that's holding everything together. And if that brick moves, then there'll be an absolute crash. Earlier today, and I'll finish on this, it was asked the question about Labour. You know, we had the informal discussion. What is the use of voting Labour? Well, to be quite blunt with you, there's only one reason to vote Labour, and that is the Tories. Last week, when we had the discussion on the United Front, the position was put forward that the Bolsheviks supported Kerensky because he was fighting, what do you call it, Kornilov. Well, I see voting Labour as, if you like, a bit of supporting, what's his name, Sunak, not Sunak, was the other one, who's the Labour leader?
Starmer.
It's Starmer, in a fight against the Tories, against the Bravermans, the Johnsons, etc. And to show up use, Labour is against them. But in reality, it'll be no use because they've already capitulated. They're not a serious opposition to the Tories. So that's a very confused way of my looking at the situation in Britain and thinking that it probably does have reflections, definitely in America and probably in other areas of Europe, because if Deutsche Bank goes, then I think it will be 2008 all over again. So thank you.
Right, thanks, John. Any other indications for discussion? I think one of the points which we have to make is that, you know, that we've talked about brick walls, but that there's no iron curtain between what we can say is the Western banking system and other banking systems. And just consider this. Russia actually has a huge holdings of foreign exchange, but mainly in dollars. China has the large stash of foreign exchange in its holdings than America itself. So in other words, this instability goes right throughout the world. There's no way in which you can say, well, we're doing something different and we can avoid the petrodollars and so forth, because the world system has become integrated. It's trying to decouple, and we can see that all kinds of measures are being put in place. But actually, when you come to finance capital, there's no way in which you can uncouple one bank from another these days. The Chinese banks are as much integrated into the world finance system as the German and the Swedish, sorry, not the Swiss banks, which is incomprehensible in the past because finance capital was always national. That's what Galbraith and the other American economists of the 50s and 60s argued. But now it's become integrated in ways which we just can't imagine. And the state also entangled in that private operation of money or guaranteeing those movements in a way which previously was unprecedented too. So we have some, what can we say, some real structural changes taking place, which actually lead maybe to temporary quiescence in the long, in the past, but into new unparalleled instability in the future. Jack, you wanted to come in again?
Yeah, I'm not sure if people have discussed the pension situation, not just in France, but globally, and that's very much related. to the crisis, to the banking crisis in the U.S. at least. In the U.S., thousands of municipalities are deeply in debt, and the debt is increasing now as debt service increases with increase in interest rate, and as it becomes harder to turn over loans. Pensions in the U.S., public pensions are based through the largest pension systems, which include California's public employee retirement system and California's state teachers retirement system, among others. And these they estimate that they will get year after year returns of 7% or 7.5%. Now, those days are coming crashing to an end. And that means, and in addition, because of lower, more unemployment, decreased hiring, fewer people are coming into the system new to pay into the pension system to support those of retirees. It's becoming top heavy with retirees. Now, this is leading to a crisis. When and if there is, and there will be, as always happens with capitalism, a disjuncture where suddenly, rather than returning 7%, you're getting negative returns on investment, and the pension funds are going into riskier investments now, trying to make their 7%. Then what is going to happen to public pensions? You've seen the what's being played out in France now. Spain is now moving against pensions. In the U.S., in Detroit, there was a default a few years ago of pensions. This is something that's going to have to be dealt with globally, and the only way to deal with it, I think, really, is through social movements, movements which link the state and the declining state of life in the U.S., the crisis in the municipalities, and so on, the budgetary crisis at every level, and the social crises, with movements to essentially turn the priorities upside down and restructure society. Now, that doesn't mean to go into the streets and turn over trolley cars and declare socialism, but it does mean going to trade unions, for example, especially, and also community organizations and organizing campaigns. In 2011, 2012, people remember Occupy. The years before Occupy, some of us were involved in a mass movement and played leading roles in a mass movement in 2009, 2010 on public education, which started at the University of California and spread throughout the state in K-12. And then in 2010, 2011, campaigns to bail out schools, not banks, and end foreclosures. And I think we have to link issues like that. If that's not done, then I think we're going to see a real immiseration among retirees and different parts of the or different parts of the class contending with one another. And that's already what capitalism tries to do, is pit one against another, retirees against active workers. So in many unions now, you have 3 tiers of pension plans. And they're not really pensions in the lower tiers. They're what's called defined contribution plans, 401ks and the like, where people essentially making put part of their compensation, their pay, into the banks and invest them in the casino on Wall Street. One more point, which is that Wall Street, the biggest players in Wall Street are the pension funds, among the biggest players. The public employee retirement system, the state teacher retirement system in California, and so on. If these go down or have significant difficulties, this is going to accelerate a fall on Wall Street. So I think that the pension issue is extremely important, and we should look to addressing it, and addressing it, I think, as I've indicated, with united front coalitions hopefully led by trade unions, together with community groups, on restoring the priorities which are upside down and providing what's needed. I'm not going to go further because I think people can fill in the dots beyond that.
Thanks so much, Jack. Look, Matthew, could I ask you to hold on just a bit and let Trish in, because she hasn't spoken on this issue just yet. Okay, Trish, please come in.
Thanks, David. To be honest, I'm going to be straight up and say I find economy really difficult to understand, economics really difficult. So I'm hanging on here, trying to hold on to understanding, quantitative easing and all of these things are really difficult concepts for me. I kind of get it, but not quite. But I do want to add, and I don't know if this is entirely relevant to what we're saying, but stop me. But I think probably we have to accept, surely, as a people, as the species, that at the moment, all of the governments, they measure success on growth. And across the world, it's all about growth. All we talk about is growth, when in actual fact, growth is going to kill us. So, we need to think about an economy, surely, that is anti-growth. We need to shrink growth. We need to think about how we redistribute resources in a way that's more efficient rather than selling more. We can't keep talking about capital and selling more and making manufacturing more. I realise that Britain is no longer a manufacturing nation. We're kind of a service industry, which is, I think, just banking, really. But I don't really understand what the banks are doing anymore. They just seem to be moving virtual money around in a virtual way that virtually none of us understand. Now, you guys seem to understand it, but I almost think it's a bit of it's kind of almost like distracts us from the real issue, maybe, and that is that we have to stop growing, not necessarily population. I'm not an anti-populationist, but an anti sort of growth in population, but growth in what we make. We need to grow planet, food, water, our natural resources should be what we're redistributing, and maybe we need to be attacking the whole idea of capital at all in many ways. And that's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing, I'm just throwing it in because, again, I don't understand necessarily if it's related, but I'm convinced that probably what's going to happen next, or what I think is happening, certainly in Britain, is they're removing money completely. And I think we're going to be a non-money economy, as in people are not going to have money, ordinary people, rich people will have jets and resources, but I don't think we're going to have money. And I think when we don't have access to money, to cash, working people will have no power at all. I think they'll be completely controlled, because cash is a kind of making a run on a bank is some feeling, even in I don't know, Sound of Music, there was some idea that we could make a run on the banks or whatever the films are. But generally speaking, there's a sense of power with cash. Now that cash is going, I think we'll just be controlled by turning off our access to our bank, our virtual money, as soon as we step out of line. I think that's probably what's coming next. So I think we've almost got more things to worry about. I don't know if any of that's relevant, so I'll be quiet now.
Well, Trish, thanks for your points. Of course, when we worry, we try and think our way out again, and the socialist revolution's on the cards. Look, again, Matthew, I must ask you to hang back just a bit, because Felicity could come in with some new points. Please come in, Felicity. So good to see you.
See all the comrades. I came wanting to listen to Michael like everybody else, because in quite a almost a lazy way, you think, okay, I read his blog, I follow what he's saying, but I do need to listen at times to and be able to ask questions. But the economy of Britain, and I'll stick to the economy of Britain for now, is seriously unstable and run by idiots. I mean, we knew when Brexit came that we were getting a particular hedge fund type of capitalists to be in control. Well, in a way, you need to think of Suella Braverman being in charge of anything, but Herr Like is also in charge of the economy in Britain. They're not only evil, they're dangerously stupid. All they're concerned about is their own wealth. Now, instability is so deep in the system, and yet we've got a working class, although we've had a flowering of industrial action, we've basically got a working class without political representation and without what we used to have, the very deep organization of the labor movement within the working class communities. That loss of that organization within the class communities is really difficult. I mean, some of you will have read our Owen's bit about Jack Jones and the history of Jack Jones recently in a Tribune article. But what Jack Jones had was not just that he was a good trade unionist, he was part of a working class movement that had people in virtually every community, every working class community in the country. And we've lost that. We're in probably the worst situation, certainly for a generation, but possibly for a couple of generations. So we would need, we can work out what we think would avoid the crash. And taking up Tricia's point, I think there is a case for a kind of ABC of economics to be produced by socialists, and I think so people would know, not in huge detail, but roughly what quantitative easing means, roughly what the different aspects of the economy mean, so that you've got some sort of grasp on it when you're talking to people, when people say, oh, the government can't afford to do this, when you can say, well, hang on, they spent more on quantitative easing in 10 years than they did in the whole of the NHS. You can bring up these basic facts, so there would be a case for doing that. And picking up the pensions issue, I mean, pensions fundamentally are part of the welfare state. Whether they're run, in a sort of capitalist way, or whether they're run by the state, or whether they're run cooperatively, they are a function of the welfare state. And frankly, they will not survive a huge crash. I mean, we saw what happened in Greece, in the crisis in Greece, where they smashed pensions. They took people's pensions, down by 50%. And people have still not got over that drop in their living standards. And what happens? We die. What's happening in Britain, older people are dying at a much higher rate than they've been dying. They reckon, just because of the NHS crisis in the A&E system, in the accident and emergency, we're losing 500 people a week. I mean, excess deaths are huge. So the situation is very, very serious. And I would hope that we do, and I'm not saying we can do it in this meeting, but I think it's a task we should set ourselves, to produce what we think we would do in the event of a huge crisis where the government fell. What's the socialist position going to be put? So there's got to be a socialist position put as to what should happen. I've been reading, and if people haven't read it, it's worth having a look at it, a book called Free by Elia YPI, and it's about Albania and what happened in both 1990 with the end of the communist regime and 1997, where like 90% of the population had their savings in what turned out to be complete Ponzi schemes, and the whole economy completely crashed. I mean, what Albania did then is, huge numbers of the population left the country. But it's worth looking at what does happen in the event of a huge crash, and to say, what would we be saying? How can we be saying something that makes sense to people? So that's a bit rambling, but what I'm saying is that we do need to follow economics, but we also need to make sure that wherever we've got contact, people know the basics of economics, the basics of socialist economics. And I think that's, we could maybe approach Michael to help us do something like that. So we've got a basics for people, and the people start thinking, in a way, under Corbyn, that there began to be this discussion about what would happen in the event of a socialist government. Well, maybe we should be going back to that, but without the modern monetary theory that was the core of Corbyn's, which I can't see. I don't understand. I don't understand how people think it works. But okay, finishing on the fact, like we are facing the possibility of serious problems. We are facing the reality of serious problems. Where, diverting for a second, my son's just dropped in and was telling me that he's a teacher, he'd been at a sort of end of term meeting, and one of the teachers said that she's renting a place. She can't buy a place, but she's renting a place to live, and she has, after she's paid all her bills, she has about £200 a month. That's her, stuff that's not committed. Her landlord's just put her rent up by £200 a month. So she has nothing she can do about it. She cannot afford to live. And that's facing a huge number of people in Britain at the moment. So, okay, we need to get the socialist ideas out there. We need to make sure that the economy is not seen as something that's non-understandable. We need to help people understand it. And we need to get ourselves organised to get those ideas out and to build the movement deep into the working class areas. And, that's a hell of a task. That's it.
Well, Leslie, thanks so much. Dominic, is that John, or are we going to have someone else to speak, and then Matthew?
Have somebody else to speak. Dominic, yeah.
Excuse the introduction.
So we take it in turns.
Okay.
The thing, I'm a bit like Trish. I'm no expert in economics and all the rest of it, but I take a simple view about what money's about. In the first place, money is supposed to represent commodities. It's supposed to have a backing of real wealth, not in bits of paper, but in actual stuff. And that is what we were told when I was young, that's the situation. These days, and this comes to quantitative easing, they just print the damn stuff without any wealth behind it. And eventually that's going to lead to inflation. Although when I raised it with Michael Roberts last time, he didn't say this inflation was caused by that, because it was other factors that were coming into it, because the banks were holding on to that paper and weren't circulating it. But more recently, the Bank of England was going to circulate that money, but stopped as soon as this bout of inflation started to happen. So you've got to think, well, what you should have in the bit of paper is something that's actually worth something. And when you put it in the bank, it's supposed to be that the bank takes that, lends it out to somebody, pays them some interest, they charge some interest on that money, and then they pay the person who's lent it them less interest than they're actually getting in. But what have you got now? You've got all these sort of bonds and all these systems within the bank about what the money is. And basically, in my opinion, that's just to cover up fraud. And I think that's what's happening as far as the banking system is concerned. And they're looking at, they're involved with drug dealers, with money launderers. They talk in this country, the Tories talk about stopping the small boats. They never talk about what the gangsters who are running these small boats do with the money they get. And what do they do with it? They stick it in the banks in the City of London, because it's the biggest money laundering centre in the world, as far as I can make out. So I think when you're talking about economics, you've got to start thinking of it in more simple terms than all the frauds and fiddles that the banks are up to, and what all these, like the crash in 2008 was caused by bonds that were basically bought by banks as bundles, and they never looked what was inside the wrapping. They wrapped it with straightforward stuff, but inside it was a whole load of junk. The Americans had gone on a binge of giving loans to people who'd never paid them back. And the people who were selling them to them people were making commission on it. So they had no interest in going, scrutiny or anything else. So the banking system is corrupt. If you're going to answer questions on it, what you've got to say is basically people have got to take it off, take it over. And the working class, through its organisations, has got to run those banks, along with other sections of fresh society. I mean, that's to my mind what you're on about. I'm a bit like John, I'm rambling a bit, but so that's my explanation of quantitative easing. As far as the inflation and instability is concerned, the capitalists will accept a certain amount of inflation. In fact, they welcome it. I think Britain's got 2% inflation that it works towards. And the way I look at that, that means a 2% cut in the workers' wages, the wealth of the workers' wages, because they're actually devaluing the currency year on year. And I think that's one thing I'd look at there. And I think what we've got to say about the finance is that a lot of it is fraud and fiddle. And what we've got to do is simplify it, and the working class should be looking at a socialist government should be looking at taking over the finance, the insurance, and all these things, and running them on a democratic basis in the interest of the working class. I'll leave it there.
Okay, that's great. Matthew, you've been waiting for a bit. Let me just make one general point. In capitalism, we have to understand the key point is contradiction. And if you look at the circuits of capital and the phases we've been through, we've had the 2008 crash, an enormous input of money into the system. It didn't really circulate that far, but at least it was put into it. Then it led to inflation in assets, in other words, in housing and in bonds and everything else. And then it was, going through a period which seemed to be recovery, but actually it's slipped back now into a system now with rising inflation, which is scaring the capitalists, mainly because if inflation continues at this level, the economic future becomes unpredictable. The 2% is what they want, as has been explained. It erodes the wages, and it provides some incentive for expansion of credit, which is a critical point now. But when the credit system becomes wobbly, which is the same as the banking system, then there are big problems. And Matthew, please come in on these issues.
Yeah. I think the thing is, I mean, for us, I think what Trish is saying about the nature of the system. I mean, I think what one of the main features of capitalism, one of the reasons why it's actually survived, is because it's obscure. Marx makes this point. I mean, it's not obvious. If it was obvious, the thing is, I mean, if you look at actually how it functions, what you've got is a small minority of people actually exploit the bulk of the population. But what they do, how the system works, is to obscure that. So things appear as oddities. So capitalists can turn around and say, well, we're generous in giving you jobs. Actually, what they're doing is exploiting you. When you work for them, they're ripping you off, because they take your product. This is a social relation. As Marx makes the point. There's a brilliant piece in Gradrissa where he says, things appear as social relations. Social relations appear as things. This is a thing, but it's actually a social relation, because what it's related to, actually, cash, is actually related to the extraction of surplus value from workers. Because especially in paper money, but even gold. I mean, gold is essentially a store of surplus value. I mean, you can look as it goes through it. I mean, you go through it in capital and other places. And so, well, your gold actually is related to the amount of labour. The value of gold is always related to the amount of labour it takes to extract the gold, and you can look at it over time. He goes through it and say, okay, well, the reason why the gold was worth that much at this point, and it went down and up or whatever else, is the availability of gold and how much time, the average labour time it took to get it out of the ground. Or if somebody suddenly, obviously, if somebody suddenly made a big discovery like 1849 in California, the price of gold went down because it was easier to get and there was more of it. So there's all this stuff, but it suits them to have it really obscure, But the fundamental thing is basically, they're exploiting the rest of us, and they want to keep it that way. The thing is also in terms of what people have said in terms of inflation. I mean, I think, if you look at the position in the 90s, I mean, quite clearly what you see was the 90s and the 2000s, of course. I mean, obviously with a position of crises all the way through. I mean, you look at it, crises, all the way from the, the late 80s in particular and onwards. The system is clearly in a parlous state. But the thing is, obviously, you've then got a position where they export vast amounts of industry to low wage economies in China and East Asia in particular, and they're able to use that to hold down prices. That's how it works, obviously to make it work like that. But of course, then it causes other problems for them. The US ruling class is quite happy to destroy much of American industry because it basically can't control the working class. I mean, you can see that here. You can see that in Britain. Obviously, under Thatcher, the thing was, obviously, with the move to finance capital, what they wanted was to escape from having to confront the working class, which they thought they could see that they could not control. Many of the in the organised workplaces, and therefore they just said, right, we'll just shut it. We'll just shut it. Because it's the easiest way of controlling is basically just to oppress the working class by removing that focal point, the rest of it, and closing down all these industries, and it worked for that for a period. And now what we're seeing is obviously the backside of that. I think that, and you can see, I've known people actually who spent. It was literally a case of good capital goods. The actual productive goods were literally physically exported in some cases from Britain to China or India or whatever else. Entire factories were actually just shipped. And in cases like in areas like say I'm in Falkirk, for instance, down the road here. I live in Glasgow. Falkirk used to have a foundry industry. All of that went to China. The machines, a lot. There's virtually nothing left. So that's how they did it. I think that in terms of obviously the US, the decline of the US is now. What it's trying to do is to rectify that, or to hold on to its position by military means, and so it's spending vast amounts on warfare. It's provoking wars, as we've seen in Ukraine. It's now moving towards a war with China, and they're openly saying they want a war with China. They've said, senior military people have said that we're going to have a war with China in the next few years, and they're nakedly preparing that. And the question, really for us is to say, okay, we want an anti-war movement. We need an anti-war movement. I think that in those, what comrades have also said is in terms of the thing is that the system, the banking system as it is now, which of course is essentially finance capital, is dealing. While you say, okay, well, technically, it's parasitic on production. So you have, as Marx points out, money to commodity to money prime, and then of course the short to that from money to money prime, but with some relation underneath to actual production. And the thing is that now what we're seeing is money which is now increasingly completely disconnected from any form of exploitation and production of surplus value for the working class, which is why it becomes increasingly unstable, because there's nothing at the back of it. So we've got huge stockpiles of money. We've got the ruling class does not want to invest in production. We've got the rise of essentially Ponzi schemes, and crypto. We can look at crypto as basically a huge Ponzi scheme. And enormous. It consumed, has consumed a large section of electricity production even in the world. It's ridiculous what they've done for that thing, But essentially, it's funneling money into this thing, and we can see from the collapse of FTX that it's just, it's a scam. The whole bloody thing's a scam. So that shows you the deep instability. I think. In terms of pensions, pensions are obviously, as people have said, is deeply at risk. you know, I mean, if we look at it, actually one of the real features of the whole issue with Truss and Kwarteng and the crazy budget, which of course blew a hole in everything in Britain, actually was the fact what it did was to make major pension funds who were investing on the basis of a strategy which they had been told to do so by the regulator, deeply unstable because of that, because of what they'd done. It actually blew a hole in many of the major pension funds in Britain, and therefore they had to go and fix it as fast as rapidly as they could. But of course, you know, the problem being, of course, all these what they've basically done is this: they keep storing this stuff up. They can't resolve it. They just keep storing it up. You know, so you can create money. You know, as they've done, they've created vast amounts of money. But the point is that money then has to be backed with something. You know, and so what you know, so what they're doing, of course, is just you're going to get something worse at the end. The thing is also, for pensions, of course, is the pension funds function as capital, which is then basically in many cases quite oppressive. I mean, look at the actions of pension funds. I mean, they're quite rapacious. You know, they're happily fund private equity or hedge funds or any of these other stuff because they want return. So your own money effectively is being used against you or against working class communities all over the place. That's the way the system works at the moment. And I mean, you can see examples of that all over the place. That, you know, clearly deeply deeply unstable. The other thing I think that's worth noting, of course, about the whole business with China, of course, is the fact that after 2008, it was the Chinese. I mean, and I think there is another debate in terms of the nature of China, because it's clearly not completely capitalist and it's clearly not entirely Stalinist. It's a weird hybrid, but because there are still elements of like a command economy within China, they were able to say, right, okay, we will reflate the world economy. And they did. I mean, they actually laid down more concrete in China after 2008 than had ever been seen in human history before, you know. And this is why you get this crazy development of the mad property scheme, which is enormous, the creation of entire cities, you know. And essentially, doing that, of course, was then able to bail out, you know, in many ways, you know, alongside quantitative easing, capitalism, at least temporarily on a world scale. Now, obviously, that comes to an end, and you know, the whole question of the conflict between China and the US then comes into play. I mean, the bizarre thing, of course, is that the US can't actually manufacture its goods anymore. You know, I mean, even if it wanted to conduct a war, you know, and the fact that it can't actually to produce what it requires to continue to exist, you know, over a period of, you know, months, because it imports so much from East Asia and China, seems, you know, fairly material, but not to the calculation of the Pentagon. The crazies who run the US state. So yeah, in those terms, I mean, you know, there's all sorts of things going on, and it's, I know I could go on for ages, but I won't. Thanks.
Okay, Matthew. Look, many thanks. Some really interesting points, including you know, a renewal of the debate about China's intersection and integration in the world economy, and all the push-pull factors there. Look, I think we've had a quite fruitful discussion. Disappointing though it's been that we've not had an authoritative lead-in, you know, which we were all very much looking forward to. I want to pass over to Roger to see what we are planning to do for next week and into the future.
Right, thank you. First of all, I do apologise to comrades. We were all looking forward to hearing what Comrade Michael Roberts had to say. He's come on several occasions before. He committed himself repeatedly to coming, so there must have been some genuine problem which has prevented him from turning up. So I hope that at a future meeting fairly soon, I hope that we'll be able to get the benefit of his insights into the question. I do think we did very well, and it shows that there's a lot of understanding and a lot of talent and a lot of knowledge among the comrades who participate. So thank you to everybody who contributed. Next week we have a week off because, not because, but taking advantage of the fact that it is Easter Sunday. We'll be convening again in 2 weeks' time, and for that we're holding a special meeting, which we hope that will be attended widely by a big section of activists in the Labour movement in Britain to talk about the crisis in the Labour Party. I would like to, if comrades will allow me, to make a little plug for a pamphlet which I've written called Labour's Coming Split, which is available online. I can put the link up in the chat. It's also, as you can see, available in print. And if anybody who wants a copy, please let me know, contact me privately with your postal address and I'll send it. But we do want a full participation throughout the movement. There's all kinds of turmoil of ideas about the situation in the Labour movement in Britain, including points that John raised earlier today, which I'm sure a lot of us would like to take up. So please do come and bring your comrades from Labour Party branches, trade union branches, in the movement generally. It will not be only relevant to comrades from Britain, because the crisis in the Labour Party is a crisis in general of reformism and of the Labour movement. So I hope everybody will come and bring their experiences and participate. That's in 2 weeks' time. Enjoy your week off next week, and thanks for coming. See you.
Yeah, comrades, thanks for quite a lively discussion, and you know, for seeing some new old faces and some new faces. Very good discussion. Thank you.